Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm John Ruggie, Director of the Mossavar Rahmani Center for Business and Government here at the Kennedy School. Tonight, we're combining two celebrations in one. We wrap up the 25th anniversary celebration of our center, and we also inaugurate the first annual Robert Glauber Lecture. For 25 years, the Center for Business and Government here at the Kennedy School has been exploring critical issues at the intersection of business and government, private and public sectors. Last year alone, we convened more than 40 conferences and seminars, produced more than 50 publications, and we engage businesses and governments literally on every continent of the world. Fittingly, the discussions of our conference have been future directions in regulatory policy, which is a theme that we continue tonight with our keynote speaker, Christopher Cox. We're also, as I say, celebrating the Robert Glauber Lecture. This will be an annual event made possible by a generous gift from the National Association of Securities Dealers, which is the private sector regulator of the U.S. security markets, now called the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority. These lectures will honor the leadership of Robert Glauber, there he is, at the NASD, where he served as chairman and CEO until September 2006, and also his long engagement with Harvard University and the Kennedy School in particular. Bob Glauber has been Undersecretary of the Treasury. He has been a professor of finance at Harvard Business School. He served as executive director of the Brady Commission under President Reagan, which was appointed to study the October 1987 stock market crash. And I just saw that Nicholas Brady is here tonight as well, and we welcome him. It's my great pleasure to congratulate Bob Glauber on the inauguration of these lectures, to thank him for being our colleague, and to ask him to introduce tonight's speaker, the Honorable Christopher Cox, Chairman of the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. Bob?
Thank you, John. And as John noted, This speech by Chairman Christopher Cox of the SEC is indeed the first in a series of annual lectures that have been made possible by a gift from NASD, the private sector regulator of the securities industry. I think it's entirely fitting that Chairman Cox should be the first speaker in this series. After all, the SEC is the regulator of NASD, or as it's now called, FINRA. But more importantly, he has been a strong supporter of industry-based so-called self-regulation as a partner with the SEC in meeting the mission of protecting investors. In my experience as CEO of NASD, the chairman was always prepared to listen to our position, and when he thought it made sense, to support it with great vigor. I've actually been very fortunate to know Chris Cox for now 25 years. Our paths have actually crossed a number of times. He was an undergraduate at USC, and then from there earned both an MBA and a JD here at Harvard. And then in the early 1980s, while he was a lawyer at Latham & Watkins, he took a year off to teach the business tax course at the Harvard Business School. At that point, I was chairman of the finance department, and we needed a visitor to teach that course. I asked my colleagues, and a number of faculty from his days as a student said Chris Cox was the person to get, called a bunch of lawyer friends, and they said he was an absolute 10-strike. Of course, they were certainly right. I did, unfortunately, fail, but I think it was to the public's benefit in trying to convince him to stay on at the Harvard Business School and make a career out of being a professor. Our paths next crossed about 4 years later when he had again left private practice, this time to be senior associate counsel to President Reagan in the White House. I was part of the Brady Commission, which had been appointed by President Reagan to study the 1987 stock market crash. In case you didn't notice, we celebrated the 20th birthday of that event last Friday with a 350-point drop in the Dow. And Chris was our liaison with the White House. I was an absolute neophyte to presidential commissions, and I will tell you I needed a great deal of adult supervision, and Chris gave it to me. Let me just stop in my introduction of Chris to make one very timely introduction. As John pointed out, we are fortunate to have in the audience with us this evening Nicholas Brady, sitting in the front row, former Secretary of the Treasury and, of course, the leader of the Brady Commission 20 years ago. I had the opportunity to work for Nick, both on the commission and later as a senior member of the Treasury staff. There's simply no wiser nor more committed public servant, or indeed a better boss, than Nick Brady. After Chris's stint in the West Wing, he resigned to run for Congress from Orange County, California. He was elected 9 times from his district. In 10 of his 17 years in the House, he was a member of the Republican, and at that time, the majority leadership. He served as chairman of a number of committees in the House, perhaps the most important of which was the Committee on Homeland Security. And among the significant laws he authored was the Private Securities Litigation Reform Act, which protects investors from fraudulent lawsuits. Chris resigned from Congress in July 2005 when he was appointed by President Bush as the 28th chairman of the SEC. He's accomplished a great deal in 2+ very active years. Let me just cite the high points. First, he brought consensus and collegiality to a commission that was riven by philosophical and doctrinaire disputes. He championed bringing the SEC's mandated disclosure system into the 21st century. Transparency, which rests on effective disclosure, is to many of us the foundation of investor protection and efficient capital markets. Chris has worked to develop and ultimately require the use of a system called XBRL, which provides investors with interactive access to data from SEC filings. It will provide a great step forward in transparency. This past summer, the SEC proposed a rule to allow foreign companies listed on U.S. exchanges to use international financial accounting standards without reconciling them to the U.S. standard, so-called GAAP. He has argued that waiting for full convergence of these standards is simply unnecessary and also too slow. Proposing this rule is actually far more audacious than it appears. Quite often, the SEC's attitude, and indeed backed by Congress, is that if it isn't made here, it's not very good. This is an opportunity and a step forward to take a set of standards which have now developed to a point where they really are very effective and allow them to be used here in the United States. Chris has also directed the SEC staff to do a top-to-bottom analysis of how the SEC complies with a 1996 law that broadens the Commission's mission to include the promotion of market efficiency and capital formation, in addition to the traditional investor protection. This analysis will focus attention on the issues of cost and burden of regulation as compared with the benefits to investors and to the markets. And finally, he has worked with the PCAOB, the regulator of the public accounting profession, to fix some of the glaring problems in the implementation of Section 404 of the Sarbanes-Oxley Law. It's the section that requires management to assess the effectiveness of internal financial controls and auditors to attest to management's assessment. The new Accounting Standard 5 gets the cost and benefits of this very important provision much better in line. So I think you can see Chris Cox has had a long, varied, and immensely important public career. We're fortunate to have people like Chris, successful in the private sector, yet willing to devote a large part of their careers to public service at the highest levels. And with Chris, we're fortunate in one more way. He's only in his mid-50s and able, and I very much hope willing, to fill some other significant public role when he completes his service as chairman of the SEC. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Christopher Cox.
Thanks, Bob. Well, thank you very much. I can't tell you how nice it is to be back here. I remember when Bob and Muff had me over to their house as a very junior faculty member in what, as Bob described, was a very short-lived career as an academic. It is especially nice to be here with Nick Brady, the Secretary of the Treasury, who brought us all together in Washington, as Bob described. Bob Posen is here also, having led MFS, a well-known name here in Boston and Cambridge. We asked him also to chair our committee on improvements in financial reporting, and he is doing a fabulous job of that, trying to squeeze all the complexity out of financial reporting so that investors can get information they can really use and understand. This is quite a distinguished group here, and I'm very, very pleased to be. It's also a very unique group because I believe you are the only people in Boston who are not already on their way to Fenway. I went by Fenway on the way here. The lights are on. There are lots of people going in, so I trust everyone here is going to watch the game on TV if you don't have tickets. It's also an honor to be delivering the eponymously named Bob Glauber, Robert R. Glauber lecture, and the first one. I will do my very best to get you off to a good start here. We have a lot to talk about in a very short period of time. If people are going to watch the game, we have to get through the remarks and the Q&A, so I want to be punctual. This is, of course, as Bob mentioned, the 20th anniversary of the stock market event that led to the creation of what's popularly known as the Brady Commission. It's also the 25th anniversary of the Masavar Ramani Center, which is focused on two very important disciplines, business and government, and their intersection. I think Bob Glauber, having spent so much time at Harvard Business School and now being back here at the Kennedy School personifies those two disciplines. I should say, the topic that he's asked me to address in my remarks tonight, the role of government in markets, likewise is a synthesis of those two topics. So at Bob's invitation, I prepared a few remarks on this topic of the role of government in markets from my perspective at the SEC. When the SEC was first created, its purpose was to serve as an independent regulator of the unbridled profit-seeking activity of self-interested individuals and firms in the securities markets. It was not, however, to supplant the market or directly to participate in it. Government ownership of the economy was an issue in other countries at the time, but not in America. In Germany, during the 1930s, the independence of the private sector was a pre-World War I memory. In the Soviet Union, where the Bolshevik Revolution wasn't yet a generation old, government virtually occupied the field. And in Italy, where Benito Mussolini's fascist party promoted an economic approach called syndicalism, nominally private property was held for state purposes. Even in France at that time, the spirit of corporatism was at large and in the ascendancy, and the government controlled many industries. But for all of the time since America's founding, our country had far less government involvement in the economy than did Europe. This was true mostly because we had less government, period. Federal revenues totaled less than 5% of the gross domestic product in the 1930s. Today, over 70% of the United States economy remains in private hands, with the rest being accounted for by federal, state, and local government. It's true that during the 1930s, America first experimented seriously with government ownership of industry. Since the nation's earliest days, of course, the government had delivered the mail. But under FDR, the U.S. embarked upon experiments in other federally owned enterprises, such as energy production. The repeal of prohibition in 1933 put many states into the retail liquor business, and many were already involved in the ownership of public utilities. But these were exceptions, and the essential approach of the Roosevelt administration was to regulate business, not to own it. So, for example, the government didn't attempt to acquire ownership of farms, even assuming that would have been constitutionally permitted, but rather chose to closely regulate production. From minimum wage laws to the abolition of child labor, to a national planning board that provided production recommendations across many industries, the New Deal aimed to forge all elements of society into a cooperative unit. This was America's response to the more radical integration of government and business that was going on in other countries. In the case of the securities markets, which also came under national regulation for the first time in the 1930s, there was never an impulse for the federal government to own the exchanges or to own the investment banks or to own the broker-dealers. The creation of the Securities and Exchange Commission in 1934 marked a deliberate effort to clearly define and separate the role of the national government on the one hand and our capital markets on the other hand. Henceforth, fraud and unfair dealing in the stock and bond markets would be subjected to external discipline by the federal government. Minimum standards would be enforced, such as requiring that every investor be told the essential details about the security in which he was investing. Registration of securities and licensing of broker-dealers would be required. It was, in short, arm's-length regulation of an unabashedly private market rather than nationalization. Over the years, as the role of the SEC and its relationship to the markets has been refined through experience, the agency has acquired three explicit goals: protecting investors, maintaining fair and orderly markets, and promoting capital formation. These three complementary missions are logically consistent with the original premise of the securities laws, which was that government is an auxiliary to the market, not a substitute for it or a participant in it. Virtually every aspect of the 1933 and 1934 Acts and the regulations implementing them follows from the notion that markets should be efficient, competitive, transparent, and free of fraud. The normative judgment implicit in this legislative and regulatory scheme is that markets are good, so long as they are in fact operating efficiently, competitively, openly, and honestly. They are good for consumers, for investors, for producers, and for our entire economy. We don't spend much time justifying this premise. But because the idea of the market is so fundamental to everything that the SEC does, it's now incumbent upon us to remind ourselves exactly why it is that we value markets so highly, because the very concept of what constitutes a market is now being reinvented. Two relatively recent developments in the capital markets, in particular, are challenging our basic approach to regulation. First, the number of government-owned or controlled corporations in our capital markets is increasing, and their size is growing. Second, the number and size of government-owned commercial investment funds is on the rise. The phenomenon of the state-owned but publicly traded company is being driven by the semi-privatization of government enterprises in areas such as banking, oil and gas, infrastructure, and real estate, among others. The result of several large public offerings of government-owned enterprises outside of the United States in recent years is that post-offering, public investors have purchased a significant amount of stock, but even collectively, they still represent a minority. The government, in turn, still controls a majority of the company when the dust settles, and it controls all of the decision-making, just as it did before the public offering. Government ownership of large investment funds, or so-called sovereign wealth funds, isn't new, but it's a markedly growing trend that raises many of the same issues of government ownership, and others as well. In operation, sovereign wealth funds are simply the investment arms of governments. But while they've existed in one form or another for many years, today they are making an increasingly obvious footprint in the global financial marketplace, growing in size relative to private assets. Today, the world's sovereign wealth funds are significantly larger than all of the world's hedge funds combined. According to some estimates, they could grow to as large as $12 trillion over the next 8 years. Both of these developments, the growing prominence of state-owned but publicly traded companies and the rise of sovereign wealth funds, challenge our regulatory model in a number of ways. First, by breaking down the arm's-length relationship between government as the regulator and business as the regulated, they call into question the adequacy of our enforcement regime. When the government becomes both referee and player, the game changes rather dramatically for all the participants. Rules that might be rigorously applied to private sector competitors will not necessarily be enforced in the same way against the sovereign who makes the rules. One need look no further than the environmental degradation within the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact under communism to observe this principle in action. When the regulator and the regulated are one and the same, deference to government-owned industry can all too easily trump vigorous and neutral enforcement. This poses several problems. One of our most basic missions is preventing fraud and unfair dealing. Will a U.S. government agency be capable of doing this if a sovereign foreign government is commercially interested in an entity that we have under investigation? Let me offer an example. Today, internet fraud is on the rise. And the only way that our government or any other can protect its citizens is to cooperate with other nations. The perpetrators of fraud on the internet aren't restrained by national boundaries. In just the last few years, as chairman, I've forged new arrangements with our regulatory counterparts overseas precisely so that we can share the information that's necessary to crack down on this kind of cross-border fraud. will the kind of cooperation that we know from experience is required in these cases be forthcoming if the foreign government or an entity that it controls is itself under suspicion? A corollary of this inherent conflict of interest that arises when government is both the regulator and the regulated is that the opportunity for political corruption increases. Graft, bribery, and other forms of political corruption by governments and by political figures is an unfortunate fact of life throughout the world, as the Commission's enforcement responsibilities under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act remind us on a daily basis. When individuals with government power also possess enormous commercial power and exercise control over large amounts of investable assets, the risk of misuse of those assets and of their conversion for personal gain rises markedly. Here's another example. One of the most important byproducts of what the SEC does is the maintenance of investor confidence. If ordinary investors, by the way, an estimated 100 million retail customers who own over $10 trillion in equities and stock funds, come to believe that they are at an information disadvantage, confidence in our capital markets would collapse, and perhaps the market with it. That's why so much of our effort is focused on full and fair disclosure to all market participants and the prevention of fraud and unfair dealing, such as insider trading. With the powers of government at our disposal, we can make life difficult for insider traders. But if the powers of government aren't used solely to police the securities markets at arm's length, but rather are used to ensure the success of the government's commercial and investment activities, not only retail customers, but every private institutional investor could be put at a serious disadvantage. That disadvantage could include significant disparities in the information that's available to government as compared to private marketplace actors. For instance, unlike private individuals and businesses, the world's governments have at their disposal the vast amounts of covert information collection that are available through their national intelligence services. Think Bill Belichick on a global scale, only with more serious consequences. Current legal restrictions in some countries on the domestic collection and use of such information might serve to protect the civil liberties of that nation's citizens. But there are normally no concomitant protections for foreign nationals or for intelligence collection activities that are conducted in other countries. Unchecked, this would be the ultimate insider trading tool. Government ownership potentially threatens transparency as well. In many industrial countries today, the ability of journalists and citizens to inquire into the affairs of government or to criticize the conduct of government is severely limited. In some countries, criticism of government policies lands you in jail or worse. Is it reasonable to expect that these same governments will be magically forthcoming with investors? The fact that minority shareholders in state-owned corporations will be dependent upon the full disclosure of governments that are not subject to independent regulation raises significant questions for securities regulators such as the SEC, whose mission is investor protection. And when it comes to transparency, the track record to date of many sovereign wealth funds does not inspire confidence. Even the economic rationale for our legislative and regulatory deference to markets is called into question when the major marketplace participants are not profit-maximizing individuals, but governments with national interests. A nation's interests, and the interests of its government to the extent that they are the same, are certainly legitimate. But by definition, a nation's interests extend beyond simply seeking return on investment through economic gains and the avoidance of economic loss. Investors and regulators alike have to ask themselves whether government-controlled companies and investment funds will always direct their affairs in furtherance of investment returns, or rather will use business resources in the pursuit of other government interests. And if the latter is the case, what will be the effect on the pricing of assets and the allocation of resources in the domestic economies of other nations? Ultimately, that's a judgment that economists will have to make. But if the trend toward government-owned or controlled enterprises and investment accelerates, as has been forecast, the answer to that question will continue to grow in importance. In these and many other ways, government ownership of companies and investment funds poses a fundamental challenge to the market premise upon which the SEC operates. So perhaps we should ask ourselves, is our premise a good one? Why do we in the United States prefer markets and private ownership to direct government ownership in the economy? Our emphasis on private ownership is directly tied to America's dedication to individual freedom. It's in our DNA. It's in large part why the United States came to be at all in the first place. Our Declaration of Independence is a recitation of the abuses of excessive governmental power. Our Constitution is a brilliantly crafted system of checks and balances to prevent that abuse by limiting government's authority over the individual, including in the economic realm, where we are guaranteed our constitutional rights to liberty and property, to freedom from expropriation, and to freedom of contract. But beyond that, beyond ideals of freedom, our national preference for private ownership is also based on the most basic practicality. It works. America's rise from New World outpost to global superpower was fueled by the dramatic growth of our free enterprise economy into the world's largest. Free enterprise has produced spectacular results. Compared to other national economies with substantial government ownership and central planning, America's economy has been more creative, resilient, and dynamic. We've found that decentralized decision-making, in which millions of independent economic actors make judgments using their own money, results in the wisest allocation of scarce resources across our complex society. And we found the market to be more reliable in heeding price signals from both producers and consumers, and in meting out discipline to failing enterprises, far more than government could ever do. The rise of sovereign wealth funds and state-owned companies is challenging us to ask whether these many benefits of markets and private ownership will be threatened if government ownership in the economy, manifested in these and perhaps other new ways, becomes more significant, or whether alternatively the world might be better off for these developments. It's a question that, at least for now, is unanswerable empirically, because we're just now beginning to see the manifestations of what some analysts are predicting will be a significant trend. But ask these questions we must, because the evidence is all around us that some, and perhaps many nations, will indeed head in these directions. If the dramatic growth in government commercial investment comes to pass as some have forecast, what does this portend for global capital markets? What effect will these new government participants in our markets have on our markets? At the SEC, our concern is that these activities not harm the investors that we work to protect every day, that they promote and not inhibit capital formation, and that they not compromise the maintenance of fair and orderly markets. One possibility is that as a result of these developments, our markets will be less transparent, less yielding to outside law enforcement, and less able to serve their role of wisely allocating scarce resources. If government-owned investments lack transparency, they could contribute to market volatility stemming from uncertainty about the allocation of their resources. The rise of sovereign wealth funds and state-owned public companies could even provoke a new round of protectionism, in which various national governments erect barriers to foreign investment in what they consider to be strategic sectors of their own economies, and in which the lines between restrictions on foreign government ownership and foreign private ownership are dangerously blurred. Alternatively, these developments could be viewed as a stabilizing and modernizing influence in global finance. The rise of sovereign wealth funds might be seen as a better way for a nation's monetary authority to stand ready to meet its balance of payments needs, through better diversification into a broader range of asset classes and the attainment of higher returns. and the accelerating trend toward privatization of state-owned enterprises, even if that privatization for the time being extends only to a minority interest and doesn't yet eliminate government control, could be interpreted as a positive step along the path to eventual full conversion from government to market ownership. Moreover, sovereign wealth funds could be welcomed as a new source of liquidity for our capital markets, while the fact that U.S. investors can now own minority stakes in state-controlled corporations might be considered simply a new range of investment choices. Which of these views is the more accurate is not self-evident. It's not simply a question of whether one prefers government or private ownership, since these latest forms of government activity are, strictly speaking, neither one nor the other. The more precise question is, as the distinction between government and private activity in our capital markets becomes blurred, at what point does the private market stop being a private market and morph into something else? And how can we even begin to answer that question on a global basis when each nation's definitions vary? Whose definitions do we use? Even in America, where today over 70% of the economy is in private hands, sporadic efforts have been made to change the role of Uncle Sam from market referee to market player. During the 1970s, for example, the California-based Campaign for Economic Democracy proposed that the United States government should own at least one significant competitor in each major industry. From the perspective of individuals who viewed the market with suspicion and government participation in the economy with approval, this would serve to keep the competition honest. In more recent years, it's routinely been proposed that the $2.2 trillion Social Security Trust Fund be directly invested in the capital markets by the federal government. This would be investment controlled by the federal government, not by the account holders, and in effect, it would create our own sovereign wealth fund with greater assets than the combined economies of Russia, India, Canada, and Mexico. These examples serve to illustrate that the question of state ownership in the economy continues to present itself in a variety of ways, not just in other countries, but in our own country as well. And they help us to appreciate that the fundamental question presented by state-owned public companies and sovereign wealth funds does not so much concern the advisability of foreign ownership, but rather of government ownership. Precisely because the rise of sovereign wealth funds and publicly traded state-owned corporations portends a greater degree of state ownership in the economy, their new prominence raises many of the same questions that any program of state ownership entails. There is one respect, however, in which it does matter. If investments are made by a foreign government rather than one's own government. One of the reasons often advanced in support of state ownership is that it's the responsibility of one's own government to promote the good of the citizenry and to put the nation's concerns first. Another reason is that the nation's citizens can influence their own governments, often through democratic means. But if the government in question is a foreign government, neither of these reasons exists. The national interest that the foreign government will presumably advance will be its own. Likewise, the citizens of other nations will have no direct way to influence a foreign government through the democratic process. From the SEC's standpoint, these differences have practical consequences. For example, the Commission has the power to pursue sovereign wealth funds for violating U.S. securities laws. Neither international law nor the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act renders these funds immune from the jurisdiction of U.S. courts in connection with their commercial activity conducted in the United States. But a discussion between the SEC and a foreign government might be quite different if, instead of seeking cooperation in an enforcement matter in which we were mutually interested, the SEC were pressing claims of insider trading against that very government. When a foreign private issuer is suspected of violating U.S. securities laws, our experience working with our overseas regulatory counterparts indicates that we could almost always expect the full support of the foreign government in investigating the matter. But if the same government from whom we sought assistance were also the controlling person behind the entity under investigation, a considerable conflict of interest would arise. Even in the United States, where we have neither federally owned corporations trading in our public markets or sovereign wealth funds, and where the presumption must be that the national government has the best interests of its citizens at heart, our government is sometimes criticized for being insufficiently aggressive when it comes to securities law enforcement. The cause most often cited is that business carries too much influence with government representatives and officials. Straying from the model of arm's-length regulation toward one of government-on-government regulation could further fuel such suspicions and undermine investor confidence. To begin to enumerate these many questions provoked by the rise of sovereign wealth funds and state-owned companies in our public markets is, of course, not to answer them. But systematizing our thoughts about the possible good and ill effects of increased direct participation in the world's capital markets by governments can help in the process of structuring norms and practices to maximize the potential benefits and minimize the risks. This important analysis is well underway in a number of venues, including the President's Working Group on Financial Markets, on Capital Markets, of which the SEC is a member, as well as the G7, the World Bank, and the IMF. The outcome of these analyses may well be more generalized agreement about the kinds of strong fiduciary controls, disclosure requirements, professional and independent management, and checks and balances to prevent corruption that will help protect both investors and markets. Meanwhile, as securities regulators, the SEC will continue to treat both state-owned companies in our public markets and sovereign wealth funds as we would any similarly situated private entity. We will continue to pursue a cooperative and collaborative dialogue with our regulatory counterparts in other nations, and to engage them regarding the best way to apply our regulatory approaches in light of the growing presence of government-owned business and investment funds in our markets. And we will continue to vigorously pursue tough, independent regulation, which is the bedrock of investor protection and the sine qua non of efficient capital markets, because in the end, our entire free enterprise system depends upon the rule of law that the SEC upholds. When ultimately policymakers in this country and around the world refine our approaches to the rise of government and capital markets, the decisions that we make will likely depend upon where we think these trends are heading. Do sovereign wealth funds and publicly traded government-owned corporations portend more market discipline and better government fiscal management, or instead a detour away from free markets and toward government displacement of the private sector economy? Much will depend, therefore, upon our judgment about what the future holds. No government policymakers can see the future, of course, but appreciating where we've come from, what we've lived through, and where we are headed offers the best hope of wise choices. This is not only my alma mater, but perhaps yours, now or eventually, and it's also John F. Kennedy's, after whom the School of Government is named. For President Kennedy's inaugural, Robert Frost wrote a poem entitled Dedication, in which he paid tribute to the wisdom of our founders, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and Madison, and he attributed their successful leadership to their extraordinary vision about what the future of America would hold. He wrote, "So much they saw as consecrated seers, they must have seen ahead what not appears." Without question, a firm grasp of history is important for national leaders. But in spite of their uncommon foresight, neither our founders nor even Robert Frost, who lived much more recently, could ever have imagined the complex world of electronic global finance that has developed in the 21st century and that today is integrating the economies of every nation on earth. So these choices are ours to make alone. But even though we can't divine the answers to such questions by consulting the wisdom of our founders, we can lean heavily on the principles that they cherished. Like Washington, Frost was relentlessly on guard against political ideology, which he regarded as a corruption of philosophy. He warned against the self-delusion that individuals in government possess enough knowledge to regulate human action down to its raw details. In a 1925 letter to his friend Louis Untermeyer, a Marxist, the great poet wrote, "I might sustain the theme indefinitely that neither you nor I, nor anybody, knows as much as he doesn't know." Frost put his finger on why America has embraced markets, because in doing so, we give substance to our dedication to individual freedom, our suspicion of government excess and abuse of power, and our skepticism that the few can make wiser choices than the many. And by our commitment to arm's-length regulation of markets, we've simultaneously acknowledged the need for the policeman and the referee, for the rule of law and the role of the Securities and Exchange Commission. Our nation's support for markets and our commitment to independent regulation represent a fragile balance. Yet it's one of such enormous strength that it's supported the hopes and the dreams and the wealth creation of the world's most powerful and prosperous nation. Today, as this approach is under stress, because other national governments seek to play a much larger role in the economy than merely regulator, we've got to return once again to first principles and re-examine both our premises and our conclusions. Perhaps with the wisdom of our founders, the humility of Robert Frost, and the help of all the bright students and faculty at Harvard University, we can fully appreciate the gravity of these problems. We will certainly need all the help and analysis that we can get. And so on behalf of all of the men and women of the Securities and Exchange Commission, please know that we are proud to be your partners. Thanks very much. Terrific. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Cox, for those thoughtful and very timely remarks. We have some time for a few rounds of questions before you have to catch your flight. We have mics set up in the usual places, 1, 2, 3, 4. The rules are, please state who you are, keep your question brief, and put a question mark at the end of it. Thanks.
Good evening. Florian Gimbel, mid-career MPA student. I was wondering if you could comment on the diminishing influence of U.S. capital markets as some of the world's most dynamic new companies from China and Russia choose not to list in the U.S. They list in other capital markets that they perceive to be, maybe less regulated. At the same time, you are in charge of protecting investors, Americans who invest overseas. How do you view these developments?
The global capital markets are more competitive now than ever before. There are more venues and more choices to raise capital and to invest your capital than ever before. In the main, this is a wonderful development. In part, you mentioned Russia, in part, it's a function of the fact that there are markets now in places that there didn't used to be. This is a wonderful thing for the American vision of free individuals and free markets. As I described in the main portion of my remarks, whether or not in all of these incipient market venues we have quite achieved fully free markets in the sense that we would define them as something else, but the fact is, in very mature marketplaces around the world, there is more competition and more choice than ever before. So that's one of the reasons, and a significant one, that there's more competition, more capital raising going on elsewhere than ever before. Still, take a look at what's going on in U.S. markets. We have by far the largest market share of any nation or any market on earth. We are attracting foreign listings at a very, very rapid clip, and in fact, the highest number this past year, and also the highest dollar volume in all but 1 year in American history. So I think the dynamic is a good and a healthy one. Some of the listings that are occurring elsewhere are listings that simply wouldn't make it in our markets. And you mentioned our role as investor protectors. we've got to keep a weather eye to that as well. It isn't just the SEC that worries about this. It is FINRA, NASD before it, the exchanges themselves and their listing standards and their rules. All of these things together, and I shouldn't fail to mention also state law, which in our system plays a big role. All of these things together are mutually reinforcing, and they have made America the highest standard for investment and for market protection in the world. It's one of the comparative advantages I think we hold in this increasingly intense global competition.
Question over here.
Chairman Cox, thank you. Sridhar Prasad, also at JD MBA. You've mentioned the role of the SEC in investor protection. Over the last 30 years, the investor base has grown dramatically so that millions of Americans are investing. But increasingly, these Americans are investing through mutual funds, some through hedge funds, and other institutional investors who are incredibly sophisticated individuals and market participants. In your role in investor protection, how do you define the word investor, and what is your archetype for that?
Well, you're right that America is now a nation of investors. The first chairman of the SEC, another Kennedy, Joseph Kennedy, could marvel that 1 in 10 Americans own stocks. Today, it's about half of all Americans, and the numbers are staggering. Investment is completely democratized in this country, and the trends are for more of the same. We define investor at the SEC to encompass the full range of institutional, individual, small retail, enormous, and everything in between. But as chairman, I have particularly wanted to focus on the retail investor for the simple reason that we're trying to maintain a level playing field and make sure that people don't feel that they are disadvantaged as a result of the information that's available to them compared to bigger players. The role of the government as an investor protector is most easily justified if you're talking about people who don't have enormous resources at their own disposal. And so everything that we do, including taking a look at the quality and the nature of the disclosure that we mandate, is with an eye to how is it being received by the ordinary investor. Probably everybody in this room is an investor in one way or another. You've got your money someplace. I hope you have enough to, if you're a student, pay your tuition at least. And so making sure that you have confidence that the whole system works for you, that it's fair and so on, is a big part of what we do.
Question over here.
Scott Harshbarger, now in practice, was a former Attorney General in Massachusetts. I had 2 questions, and I do have 2 questions, but I want to make one comment. One is Arthur Levitt, when he was chairman of the SEC, said that one of the big problems was that the cop was asleep on the beat, that to some extent during the scandals, the SEC was not in action, that it was left in many cases to either state attorneys general or others to deal with some of the responsibilities of the SEC. That's one major issue. It seems to me that you have absolutely struck a balance here that is it's been very important for law enforcement, I believe. I think it's been an important balance, and I think you've returned the SEC to a level of very important primacy in this area. That also raises the question, though, what do you do when you have a major crisis like now emerges perhaps with a subprime mortgage issue, where perhaps investors, perhaps many citizens have been affected. On the other hand, there's a huge balance with how do you deal with the implications of this for credit and obviously a number of major institutions. And I wonder how you think about that kind of an issue. Is it a local enforcement issue right now in your view? Is it international, or is there a role that you expect the SEC to play here?
Well, the SEC certainly has a major role to play, and certainly the states do. The Congress does. Other federal regulatory agencies do. I think, let me just start with the role of the states, though, because that's how you couched all of this. I think that there was a time post-Enron when the sometimes healthy competition that can exist between different layers of law enforcement should be collaborative, but sometimes a little competition can spur people on to do better, that competition got a little edgy. And so what I've been able to do, in part because of the distance between the commencement of my chairmanship and all of those problems, but also because of a determined effort, is really focus on the way that states and the federal government reinforce one another. The Blue Sky authorities were there first. In some cases, they are deeper, richer, certainly different than what the federal government has, and when you put them all together, they're much more powerful. So we've been looking for ways through NASA, which is not the space agency, it's the North American Securities Administrators Association, and with our direct relationships with individual states to partner. And some of you may have seen our seniors initiative, where we went on a sweep in many states after these free lunch seminars where people were victimizing senior citizens and stealing their life savings. We could not have done this alone. States could not have done this alone. When we did it together, we got fabulous results, and it's helping us build the partnership to do other things. We're working together on stock option backdating cases. We're working together on subprime, which is, gets me to the last part of your question. The SEC, as I mentioned in my remarks, is a member of the 4-agency President's Working Group on Capital Markets. The Treasury heads it up. It includes the Fed, it includes the SEC, and the Commodities Futures Trading Commission. As policymakers, we can put our different perspectives, our different responsibilities together, in the same way that states and the federal government can complement each other, we can. And so when it comes to subprime, we can take a look from the bank standpoint as well as the security standpoint. How is this working? The securitization of what were originally bank obligations is what gave us the whole subprime mess. And so it's very important that we have this kind of collaboration. But the short answer to your question is there is most definitely a role here for everybody, legislatures, policymakers, regulators, law enforcement. And the more that we put our resources together, the more we'll get done and the better it'll be. Question?
Thank you, Chairman. My name is Chana De Silva, a securities regulator myself from the SEC Sri Lanka. My question is around the alternative market, a stock market, a financing market for social enterprises. As you know, there's growing interest in some quarters about providing a sort of a platform which is to provide finance on a sustainable manner for social enterprises which are growing in stature. And they feel that the traditional stock exchanges may not be a perfect fit because the drivers of traditional stock markets are different, they are more stringent, and that might not be a perfect fit. And then the question arises, is there a possibility of an alternative stock exchange to emerge on this, to respond to this need? And I'd like to hear your response to this. Thank you.
Well, the answer is unequivocally yes. There have been other similar experiments. Some have failed, some have been successful. Microfinance continues to be an alternative way for people to meet needs, micro-lending and so on. If you take a look at what's going on in something as seemingly trivial as fantasy leagues or wagering on political futures in countries around the world and so on. I mean, markets can solve a lot of problems. And so the idea that an exchange that's set up to handle one part of society's needs has to be a perfect fit for every new idea is obviously mistaken. We shouldn't be slowed down or deterred because what we're seeking is not what we're getting out of an existing exchange. Just invent a new one. And to the extent that this is going on, I think it can be very, very successful. The internet, the ability that people have now to communicate and exchange information, in particular financial information around the globe, inexpensively or perhaps at nearly zero cost, means that this kind of collaboration can happen more quickly than it's ever happened before. And so good ideas are going to catch on. I don't know whether what people might come up with in this respect will fall under the regulatory regime of the Securities and Exchange Commission under laws and authorities that were written 74 years ago. But maybe if they don't, you'll get to innovate even more quickly.
We have a ringer over here for you.
Mr. Chairman, let me return to one of the themes in your remarks, foreign government ownership of companies. And let me talk about a set of companies that are of particular interest to the SEC, which is exchanges. SEC has been concerned at some level about individual owners of exchanges and has actually, as I understand, put a cap on the amount of voting control any individual investor could have in an exchange. Does the layer of potential foreign government ownership of these exchanges pose particular problems in your mind?
Well, it's simply not addressed in our rules or in the exchange's rules. So it is brand new in that sense. We've gone very, very quickly from the public utility model to demutualization, for-profit, and now that it's for-profit and shares can be traded, guess what? We've now got these new questions that arise. And so the rules haven't anticipated them. The rules may, however, deal with them, and at least thus far that seems to be the case.
Yes.
Yes, hi. Thank you for your remarks. My name's Henry Mooney. I'm a mid-career MPA student. I'm actually on leave from the IMF this year, and I was fascinated by the emphasis that you placed on the rise of these sovereign wealth funds and the challenges that they pose for financial markets and regulators. And as you mentioned, there's a lot of discussion now about how we can go about regulating or supervising these entities, which are likely only to grow in size. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on what the structure of a supranational regulator might, what sort of an institution you think might emerge from these discussions, and what sort of disciplines or supervisory framework we might need in order to properly supervise these entities.
Well, your suggestion of a super or supra, which did you suggest? Supra, national regulator. I think we already have a super national regulator. But your suggestion is at least a step ahead of the thinking that I've been involved with thus far. I suppose that the idea suggests itself naturally, and so it must have been suggested many times in the past. But in the current discussion, I'm not sure that's where things are focused. I think what has been suggested thus far is the idea of best practices, for example. And obviously, if you're talking about sovereign wealth funds as opposed to state-owned corporations with publicly traded securities, there are many different varieties of those, and they themselves take many different approaches. And so part of the exercise is to look at them and ask yourself, what about each one seems to work, and what poses risks, and from that infer a way forward.
Question over here?
Thank you. My name is Jack Lee. I am a Fulbright visiting scholar to HR program at Kennedy School. And my question is, I think that the most difficult issue in the capital market has been the insider trading resulted from information asymmetry, or the problem of the transparency of information. I'm wondering, what is the role of the SEC in protecting the shareholders or investors from the issue of the insider trading? Thank you.
Well, that is straight down the center line of our authority. We have responsibility for enforcing the laws against insider trading and the rules against it. And so if it's going on in our markets, then we can enforce against it. I mentioned that there is nothing in international law, nothing in statute that changes that equation for sovereign wealth funds operating inside U.S. markets. So we would be very, very interested in and concerned with that. I mentioned, on the other hand, that government-on-government regulation is hard. It's just different. It's harder to do. I am absolutely certain, much more of my time than any previous chairman on international matters because of what's going on around me. because of the merger of the New York Stock Exchange and Euronext, because of NASDAQ's interest in the LSE and now OMX, because of all the other exchange combinations and relationships that are being discussed or have already been struck. Investors are going global now as never before. We're taking a look, as Professor Glauber mentioned at the outset, at international financial reporting standards being used here in the United States. All of these things have forced us into one another's arms. I just alluded briefly earlier to what's going on the internet, but from a securities enforcement standpoint, that too is another fact impelling us to cooperate. So we've got to work together as national regulators. And yet, while we do this, I know to a certainty that there will be much more resistance if we are purporting to oversee our foreign regulatory counterparts or our foreign government friends as against cooperating with them and working with them. And if they are the frontline regulators for themselves, that conflict of interest is just baked in. We may never get to see many of the things that we should in that context.
Well, Chairman Cox, we need to let you get back to Washington, and we need to let these folks go and cheer on the Red Sox. So thanks again for being here this evening. That was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.